Abolitionists knew that homing in on the treatment of enslaved women would provoke a lot of outrage. Even though the British public did not see Black women as sort of proper women, they did think that assaulting women of any race was barbaric. So, all of this is to say, enslaved women featured heavily in abolitionist material.
Welcome to Whispers of the Past. I'm your host, Fie de Wit. In this part 2 of Golden Rock Dreams and Nightmares, we unravel the striking contradictions of St Eustatius during its Golden Rock era, between 1750 and 1800. This was a time of immense prosperity, and the island thrived as a global trading hub, connecting continents and fueling revolutions. Yet, beneath the prosperity lay a complex reality, one of exploitation, enslavement, and society sustained by human suffering. These contradictions force us to ask critical questions. How do we reconcile the celebrated wealth of a place with the suffering that underpinned it? Whose voices have been lost? And why does this matter as we examine the legacy of colonization? The history of St Eustatius has often been told through the colonial lens, centering on the actions of European men. Missing from this dominant narratives are the enslaved, whose labor sustained the island's wealth, and women, whose roles were shaped by both resilience and compliancy. In this episode, we seek to uncover the silence in history and bring to light the voices that are often overlooked. Amongst these overlooked stories are those of women who navigated system of power and patriarchy. There is some archival material from this time period about some of the elite women of St Eustatius. Women like Judith Godet Maxwell de Graaf and Sarah Godet Benner Don Lovick. They influenced the consolidation of wealth and power through strategic marriages, inheritance, and property management. Yet, their privileges were built on a system of exploitation that depended on the labor of the enslaved. This duality of resilience and complicity challenges us to approach history with nuance. How can we honor the strength of these women while confronting the systems they upheld? As we explore the legacies of St Eustatius, we continue to amplify the stories that were left in the shadows and reflect on the shared but unequal experience of those who lived through these transformative eras. To begin, we revisit a pivotal moment in the island's history with Mr. Richardson, the island's heritage inspector.
Slavery is still not abolished. And you would see a lot of strange things later on that would happen, especially in the early 1800s. But before that, after the islands, salutes the American flag, recognizes USA as an independent country, it still goes kind of pretty well. Everyone is still welcome on St. Eustatius. You have the Jewish community, you have the Anglican community, the Dutch Reform, you have Anabaptists, you have everyone, you have Catholics that were worshiping in private residences. So you have everyone is basically welcome on St. Eustatius.
Within the thriving community of St. Eustatius were women who quietly influenced its prosperity and social fabric. Judith Godet Maxwell de Graaf was born into a wealthy planter family, solidifying her influence through her marriage to Commander Johannes de Graaf. Together, their combined wealth and social standing positioned Judith as a key figure during this era, overseeing vast plantations and properties. Her story challenges the notion that only men drove St Eustatius' economic success, revealing how marriages, inheritance, and strategic alliances allowed women to navigate the constraint of colonial patriarchy. Similarly, elite women like Sarah Godet Benner Don Lovick played crucial roles in consolidating wealth and power. Born into prominence, Sarah's influence extended far beyond her household. Through 3 strategic marriages to Heinrich Benner, William Dunn, and Thomas Lovick, she united some of the island's most lucrative plantations under her control. Her alliances with influential families like Benners and Dunns ensured her descendant inherited a vast network of wealth and property. This consolidation of land, highlights the critical but often overlooked contributions of women in shaping the island's economic foundations. Judith's and Sarah's stories, along with others, demonstrate how women operated within the colonial system to secure influence. Their legacy reveals a complex dynamic of power, gender, and wealth in a time dominated by men. Amongst these figures was Johannes de Graaf, governor of St Eustatius, during its most transformative years. Born into an influential island family, de Graaf's rise to power paralleled the island's emergence as a global trading hub. He had immense wealth, owning 10 plantations. He was a holder of 300 enslaved people and had 16 trading ships. Yet, de Graaf is perhaps best remembered for his bold recognition of the American independence. In 1776, he saluted the American warship, the Andrew Doria, making St Eustatius the first foreign power to acknowledge the United States of America. While we were being celebrated by the Americans, this act infuriated the British, placing St Eustatius at the center of a global conflict. These stories of wealth, revolution, and exploitations are deeply intertwined. Elite women like Judith and Sarah used their positions to shape family legacies, but their privileges were underpinned by a system of enslavement and inequalities. As we examine these women's agency, we must also confront the systems they uphold, reflecting how power, privilege, and exploitation shape the fabric of St Eustatius and the world beyond. While the wealth of St Eustatius was shaped in part by the influential individuals, the island's prosperity extended far beyond families like the Gebied and the Graafs. Its thriving economy drew people from diverse backgrounds, creating a community where culture and opportunities intersected. This prosperity wasn't limited to the elite. Free people of color and wealthy merchants also carved out spaces of influence within this independent island nation. Yet, as we delve deeper, we see that this era of wealth and opportunity came with stark inequalities, both visible and hidden in the shadows of history. With this in mind, we return to Mr. Richardson.
It's a free-for-all, as long as you pay. You even have free people of color that were living on the island, and everything is going bliss. And you're kind of like this wealthy, independent nation. And of course, St Eustatius was also known for even wealthy merchants at that time printing their own coins with their own names on it. Think of a Gosling, etc. So the island is just extremely wealthy.
This wealth wasn't coincidental. St Eustatius' open roadstead made it one of the busiest ports in the world. By the 1780s, we were attracting ships from Europe, Africa, the Americas, and beyond. But this prosperity came at a profound human cost. To understand the scale of the economic engine, we turn to archaeologist Dr. Stelton, who shares with us the island maritime history.
So in the 1770s and the 1780s, there were between 3,000 and 3,500 ships that dropped anchor in Statia each year. And those are only the ones that are recorded, right? So there were probably interlopers and the people who were trading illegally as well, probably in the remote bays to the north, like Tumbledown Dig Bay and Jenkins Bay. But the recorded ones between 3,000 and 3,500 every year. So that's a significant number of ships. And they were coming from all over the world. They were coming from Europe, from North America, from throughout the Caribbean, from West Africa, South America. And all of that was possible because Statia has such a large open roadstead where all these ships can anchor. So that is by far, I think, the most important and defining feature if you look at the maritime history of the island, and especially in the 18th century.
November 16, 1776 marked a pivotal moment in St Eustatius' history. On this day, the island saluted the Andrew Doria, an American warship that played a key role in the naval efforts during the American Revolution. The Andrew Doria's arrival in St Eustatius harbor was symbolic, as it was part of a broader movement of American vessels seeking international recognition and support from their struggles against Britain. For some, this salute was a bold gesture of freedom and revolution, but for other colonial powers, it was seen as a direct challenge to their authority. Governor Johannes de Graaf's decision to recognize the United States wasn't a mistake. At the time, St Eustatius almost acted like an independent nation, with the slow communication between The Hague and Oranjestad, leaving the island to make its own decisions. However, this recognition came at a heavy cost. It transformed St Eustatius from a neutral trade haven into a target for British revenge, dragging the island into a global conflict. Mr. Richardson will now walk us through this pivotal historical moment.
And of course, the American independence is being heavily supported by St Eustatius. And St Eustatius at that time kind of acts like an independent nation because correspondence between The Hague and Oranjestad would have taken months. What you see is interesting is that, November 16 comes around and we have a governor called Johannes de Graaf who salutes the Andrew Doria, actually the brig of war, sails in and fires shots. And Johannes de Graaf, who's the governor at the time, replies to these shots, also kind of solidifying that first salute, as they call it, and recognizing America as an independent nation. But what's interesting is many people thought and think it was a mistake. It was not a mistake because, Johannes de Graaf, who's the governor at the time, he was born into this role. The governorship of these islands were kind of a dynasty. They were royalty outside of royalty in Europe. Johannes de Graaf, his father was governor at the time, so he should have known this. And his father was governor at the time when America was already fighting the War of Independence against the British. So Johannes, as a young boy, he should have known this. And Johannes's grandfather was governor of St Eustatius. And if you go further, his great-grandfather was governor of St Eustatius. That's already like 5 generations down the line of governorship. How could you not know the rules of engagement? So these things were no mistake. They fully well knew what they were doing.
While the American Revolution reshaped global power dynamics, St Eustatia faced a different kind of upheaval. In October of 1780, one of the deadliest hurricanes in recorded history struck the Caribbean. The hurricane left a trail of devastation, profoundly impacting St Eustatius. Homes were destroyed, lives were lost, and livelihoods were disrupted. This catastrophe marked a crucial turning point for the island. As it began to rebuild, St Eustatius became increasingly vulnerable both economically and politically. Mrs. Soutekouw, a long-term island resident and one of the founders of the Island Center of Archaeology and Research, recounts the history of this period of growth and struggle that shaped the island's future.
And our agreement here on station was to trade with the American colonies and provide them their arms, their ammunition, their other things that they needed during the war. But this was the biggest period of Eustatius growth. Then with the hurricane of 1780, which had greatly affected the population, it occurred in October of 1780. And a lot of people died during that hurricane, and a lot of houses were destroyed, and Eustatius had to rebuild. Unfortunately, February of 1781, English finally had enough of our trade with the colonies, and the Rodney captured the island. And this was a period where Eustatia went downhill, and the warehouses were closed, and we were in bad shape from 1781 to 1784.
In December of 1781, St Eustatius became the focus of British frustration. Officially declaring war on the island, King George III and his government targeted its vital trade network, accusing St Eustatius of aiding in the American Revolution. This marked the beginning of one of the most turbulent periods in the island's history. The British invasion wasn't just a military act. It was a calculated effort to dismantle the economic engine that had been supporting their rivals. Mr. Richardson continues.
So you see that's already going to go downhill from here, economically, but also socially. This is going to lead to 1781, where the British actually are now coming in. And in an official decree, actually, that I saw, original of the 26th of December, 1781, the British declares war.
The British invasion, led by Admiral Rodney, was marked by paranoia and cruelty. Rodney's suspicion of the island's inhabitants, merchants, Jewish families, and free people of color spiraled into harsh and devastating measures. Entire communities were uprooted, assets were seized, and the once thriving social fabric began to unravel fast. Rodney's occupation wasn't just a military campaign. It was a direct assault on the diverse, interconnected communities that made St Eustatius so unique.
King George III, who is supposedly mad at this time, he declares war on St Eustatius. And to this day, it is said to be one of the longest deliberations ever of the House of Parliament in Westminster. And you see that it's a long declaration of war. It's more than 10 pages where they go into the extent of what is to be done to St Eustatius. And then there's this admiral, this Lord Burke is his name. And he closes off this session just before like the gavel goes down. So you can kind of reimagine it as being in the House of Commons in the UK. And, you know, all of these crossbenchers are screaming at each other. And then here is this Edmund Burke is like, you know, and before we end, I just want you to say this, like, think the island, think it, think her, you know, I want to see St Eustatius at the bottom of the sea where it belongs. It has no defenses, and its only glory has been its location and its trade. And you really get the essence of Lord Burke's anger at St Eustatius for helping them aid the USA. And one can only think the tantrums they must have had knowing that St Eustatius was like a bad word for the British. So then the Fourth Dutch Anglo War that comes between the English and the Dutch was actually declared on St Eustatius and dependencies. Many people don't know this, but when the British were sailing down and the British were gathering from other islands, they actually distracted St. Martin first. St. Martin was also part of this destruction.
The British attack on St Eustatius was carefully planned. Before focusing on the island itself, they first targeted neighboring islands like St. Martin, knowing it would be difficult for anyone to help if the island fell. With St. Martin captured, they then turned their attention to St Eustatius. The result was a devastating blow to the island's trade economy, but the British occupation didn't end there.
They knew there was nothing much on Saba. It was high, it was isolated, it was much smaller, but they actually sailed into St. Martin first and knew if they burned Fort Amsterdam and they kind of captured St. Martin, there was no one else to help because that was the last Dutch island in that corner. So they did that. So it was carefully planned. And then Rodney came in and then what they call the plundering, not technically because the trade, Rodney kind of allows the trade to continue during his period because he's kind of fooling everyone off, you know, and then Rodney stays on the island. And what's interesting is many of the things that Rodney would have accounted for in his journals, in his diary while being on the island, eventually fast forward now in parts of Statia's collective memory in a lot of plays and the way a lot of people behave. And even in the funerary customs of how people still bury people, it all comes from the British occupation of the island.
Rodney's occupation left a profound impact on the island. The trauma of his actions influenced not only the immediate residents, but also the cultural fabric of St Eustatius, particularly in customs like burial practices. His paranoia and control tactics shaped social behaviors that endured for generations.
So you see that it's so traumatic that it's still part of society today, the way people bury people. For example, I've read one of his documentation of it. So one morning there's a funeral and Rodney is now staying in the present day museum. And from the balcony, he looks out the window and in the direction of the Jewish synagogue, he sees there's a funeral going on and there's everyone in black and everyone is crying. But also Rodney noted that there were quite a lot of funerals on the island. It's like everyone was dying. Like it was a trend. If you weren't dead, you weren't part of the trend. And everyone was just dying. And Rodney decides, you know what? I'm going to get dressed. And he fetches to get a horse. And he mounts himself on the horse and he goes to pay his respects to this funeral.
Rodney's curiosity led to a chilling moment that mirrored the growing tension of the occupation. His decision to attend a funeral, observing it from a distance, would mark a strange chapter in the history of St Eustatius, where paranoia and fear were at the heart of everyday life.
And Rodney drilled down in his journal after that, when the casket was passing, he wanted to pay his respects. And there weren't the caskets with the lids like we know them today. It was just a cover that would go on. And Rodney kind of, out of curiosity, wanted to look in. And he kind of, looked in from his horse and also, realized something was off here. And when the person in the casket saw, of course, the sword edging towards them, he jumped out of the coffin and ran up the road, what we call Forteranjesstraat. He ran up that road. And Rodney recorded this in his journal. So it's insane that something like this actually happened. And people ran with fright, not because the dead was awake, but because they know they were busted.
This incident symbolizes Rodney's growing distrust of the island's inhabitants. His paranoia spiraled, leading to a widespread social disruption. As Rodney tightened the grip, entire communities, Jewish families, merchants, and even free people of color faced brutal measures, forever altering the fabric of St Eustatius.
And that's when they saw that under the coffin, there were a lot of valuable documents, papers, and deeds, and that. So people were trying to bury their valuables as well. And then Rodney goes basically ballistic because now it's like all of these funerals, were they real, were they fake? He becomes almost paranoid here. He becomes kind of this evil deviant. He's like exporting the Jews. The Jews are all rounded up. And I think they're placed in the building that's currently the dive shop. I think it's that particular building was the weighing house. And you see that the Jews are all put in that building, separated. The men from the women are put in another cellar. The men are in another building. Free people of color are free no more. All enslaved people that were free at the time are reinstated into slavery. Rodney is becoming extremely paranoid. And he starts to auction off the stuff that out of the synagogue, and the Jews are being expelled at high rates. Something that would have been labeled anti-Semitic, under today's standards. Rodney didn't only do that to the Jews, but also to the Catholics, the rich merchants, the Dutch merchants, free people of color. So he attacks every part of Eustatius society in his paranoia. It's about 1783 now, I think, 1782, 1783.
Rodney's actions during this period revealed a brutal attempt to control every aspect of the island's society. His measures left deep scars, marking a turning point in the lives of St Eustatius' diverse communities. The legacy of Rodney's tactics lasted far beyond the 18th century, disrupting cultural norms and leading to superstitions that influenced St Eustatius' burial practices and collective memory for generations. This enduring impact is a testament how deeply historical events shape communities, not only through their immediate consequences, but through the echoes they leave in cultural traditions and shared history.
So, of course, out of that, a lot of superstition developed. Many plays that were written by Ellis Lopes, they were all funeral plays. And every play, someone jumps out of a coffin. In Europe, it's normal to put your favorite thing in the casket, etc. But you see that people begin to not do that for a long time on Statia out of like, oh, if you do it, then, Rodney's going to still come. So you see that people stop like for a very long time, colloquially, like out of superstition, people no longer want to bury someone with coins or with anything of value because, it keeps the spirit awake. They will not rest out of fear of Rodney coming back. And you see all of these weird kind of mythical stories then develop out of something that actually happened. So you see how that kind of a historical fact trickled down 200 years later into superstition of station society. And I think that is, again, really interesting how history kind of shapes society, whether it's a big place or a small place. You always kind of connect it to something that happened.
As Mr. Richardson illustrates, the trauma of Rodney's occupation left an incredible mark on the cultural and social fabric of St Eustatius, creating superstition and traditions that endured for centuries. But even as these legacies took root, the island itself faced continual upheaval. St Eustatius, once a thriving hub of trade, became a pawn in a larger geopolitical chess game of colonial powers. The era following Rodney's occupation was marked by a relentless back-and-forth struggle for control. We now return to Mrs. Soutekouw, who continues a timeline of St Eustatius' history.
The French came in and rescued us in 1784. By 1790, we had built all of that back. 1790, the station population, as well as the amount of trade, was the highest it ever was. Unfortunately, in 1794, the French were to capture us again, close the warehouses down. From 1794 to 1816, Statia was played volleyball back and forth between the English and the French, with the Dutch only being able to rule a few years, and Statia's prosperity died.
Rodney's occupation wasn't the end of St Eustatius' struggles. Between 1781 and 1816, the island became a pawn in a larger geopolitical battle of Europe, repeating invasions by British and French, coupled with declining trade, marked the beginning of the island's economic and social decline. Once celebrated as the Golden Rock, St Eustatius faced a grim future as its prosperity faded into memory. Amongst this turbulence, the enslaved population was not passive. While the island's economy fortune declined rapidly, its enslaved community was undergoing significant transformation. Freedom was being gained, new roles were emerging, and the cultural shift was beginning to take root. Questions of freedom, identity, and resilience grew increasingly significant, as some enslaved individuals carved out spaces of autonomy and began to influence the island's cultural and social fabric. To understand how these changes reshaped Statia's enslaved community, Mrs. Soutekouw continues.
A lot was happening with them. There were a lot of slaves that were gaining their own freedom. We know that there were quite a few freed slaves on Statia. There were some slaves that were actually beginning to work with the government, with the authorities. One of those slaves, a former freed slave, was actually the whipper of our founder of our Methodist religion, Black Harry. The man who whipped him was a former slave. There were slaves who were escaping. There were slaves who were able to buy their freedom. There were slaves that had profession, and those people were often recognized for their profession. Some of the slaves on the waterfront, many of them evidently, learned how to read and write because oftentimes when they had run away, there would be advertisements directed to those slaves in the paper saying, if you will return home, you won't be punished. So a lot was going on. They were getting more involved in the religions. That was the time Methodism started here on the island, which was at the beginning just the religion of the slave. By the time Methodism really was going in the early 1800s, there were white people on the island who had joined that religion. They were mostly Catholic. They were practicing probably some of their own religion. A lot of that we don't know. We'd love to learn more about it. And hopefully that's going to be done.
As the island's social fabric shifted, the stories of the enslaved population became intertwined with the broader colonial struggles. While the resilience of the enslaved people shaped St Eustatius' history, their experience often remained hidden from the mainstream historical narrative. We now turn to Dr. Allain, historian and teacher, who will provide a broader regional perspective on the experience of enslaved women and their roles in the resistance, as well as how these narratives played into the larger abolition movement.
And because this was the 18th century, direct allusions to sexual violence were rare, but a lot of abolitionist material sort of indirectly referenced the sexual assault of enslaved women. Abolitionists knew that homing in on the treatment of enslaved women would provoke a lot of outrage. Even though the British public did not see Black women as sort of proper women in the sense that, bourgeois white European women were proper women, they did think that assaulting women of any race was barbaric. So all of this is to say enslaved women featured heavily in abolitionist material. I'll also note that the movement to end Atlantic slavery ushered in a period known as amelioration in the British Caribbean. British abolitionists ran a very effective campaign to expose the horrors of slavery, and many members of the British public, even if they didn't really believe in the idea of racial equality, were appalled by stories of, sexual torture, physical torture, etc., that characterized Atlantic slavery. And amelioration can largely be conceptualized as a cluster of legislation intended to kind of soften and humanize slavery, a sort of PR campaign that was ultimately intended to prolong slavery.
As we close part 2 of Golden Rock Dreams and Nightmares, we reflect on the time when St Eustatius stood at the heart of a global conflict. The island's wealth and strategic importance placed itself at the center of American Revolutionary War and European colonial rivalries. Yet, beneath the surface of these grand narratives lies the untold stories of those whose lives shaped and were shaped by these events. In the historical records, we often encounter women's stories only in fragments, and they're predominantly those of the elite women like Judith and Sarah, whose strategic marriages and inheritance allows them to navigate the structure of power. Their stories show how privilege operated within the inequalities of a patriarchal colonial system, where even the most privileged women face limitation tied to their gender. But what about the countless enslaved and marginalized women, whose names history have not preserved? Their lives reveal another form of resilience, one rooted in survival, resistance, and the quiet defiance of a system built to oppress. This duality invites us to ask, what can we learn from the struggles and agencies of these women, both privileged and oppressed? And how does understanding their lives inspire us to confront the inequalities that persist in our world today? As we move into the 19th century, we are left with many gaps and questions. Though our focus has been on St Eustatius, this island reflects the broader world, its struggles, inequalities, and transformation mirroring global patterns. May we stay curious, seeking to understand the complexities of history, so that together we can make choices that lead to a more humane world.